Today I'm going to show you how to make lo-fi drums from scratch. I'm going to make those lo-fi drums from scratch, but before we dive in, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to follow along, all the samples can be downloaded. I've put a link in the description below. Right, let's get into it. Let's load up the drum break. BPM is 80. Right, let's add a new audio track. Let's call it drums, or maybe drum loop, because we'll be adding other drums later. So head to your sample pack, drag in the sample, drum break. So now we got something in. This drum break is going to warp into time. We're going to dirty it up a little bit. Typically, a lot of these things have dirt in it, and this comes from a sample pack I've made, so it's going to have dirt in it. But I'm going to make it extra dirty, if that makes sense. I'm going to be using the Ableton saturator, and this is just going to add some clipping and some nice stuff in there. So we're going to crank this up to about 12 or 13. Bring the output down, approximately compensate, so we're not blowing your ears off. Okay, let's add a bit of bass control. It's really subtle, but it's just adding a nice extra bit of dirt. Right, so next, make sure to grab an EQ8, and we're going to use both the high pass and the low pass filters. And what I want to do is give it that radio sound. So I'm basically going to low pass it to around 300 to 400 and bring that high end down. So I want that top end of the sound a bit so that you start to get that muffled kind of radio sound, or like a drum room mic. And don't forget, we will be adding a kick and a snare to this, so that room is going to be filled. Lastly, I'm going to do some cool rhythmic stuff with AutoPan. I really like to use this because it allows me to make rhythmic sounds even more rhythmic, if that makes sense. What we're going to do is set the phase to 0, so there's no left and right. Basically, now it's just acting like a tremolo or an amp modulation. I'm going to set it to quarter note. Can you hear that? It brings out those kicks and snares because it's right on the beat on every quarter note. That just makes it sound kind of nice. And yeah, it ties it all together and makes it a bit more rhythmic. Right, that's now sounding a lot more lo-fi. Well, that's the bulk of the drum loop there. We're going to be adding a kick, a snare, and a hat next. So let's add the kick. I'm going to put a kick on every bar. We want that nice solid introduction to every bar. The cool thing is with lo-fi hip hop is no matter how weird rhythmically you get, you've still got it in time on the track. So you can essentially start again on a new bar right on the beat and it sounds in time. So it's a really cool way to get wonky with the rhythm, but still, have it sounding in time and not super weird. Right, I'll show you what I mean. So what we'll do is in this track is add a couple of kicks that are just slightly off grid. One basically on the and another one right at the on the fourth bar. You'd normally have a pattern like this. Anyway, it's pretty standard. And I'm just going to add the snare. Now the snare is going to go on 2 and 4. So let's drag in that snare sample. You want the snare to punch through quite loud. The kick in the snare normally are quite heavily rhythmic in hip hop in general, but also in lo-fi hip hop, they have really helped give that energy and vibe to the track. Don't be afraid to have it louder, in this track, we'll kind of pretty much leave it where it is. And I'm going to mix it later after I've mixed the kick drum. Now, I like my kick in lo-fi to be a bit thumpy. You don't really want a clicky kick. So now, as this sample is from one of my lo-fi sample packs, see the description for a link to the full drum kit. It already has a lot of highs taken out, but I'm still going to attenuate it just a bit. I'm going to take out a little bit of those highs still. For this, I'm using an EQ, channel EQ, as opposed to an EQ8, because I know it's somewhat of an analog modeled EQ, and I like the sound of it. I'm using the boom capture preset. Next up, add some saturation. Using Ableton Saturator, I kind of do this while I'm listening to the kick and the snare together, and then I'll finish off in solo. That's just how I like to work. Right, got that. Now I'm going to add, as the last step, Ableton's bit crushing plugin, Redux, just to give it that low fidelity sound. Setting it to 8 bits, and again I listen to it, but you do this to taste pretty much. Okay, cool. Now the snare. For the snare, pretty much exactly the same as the kick, except I'm going to use an EQ8 here. Roll off a little bit more of that high end taste, but also remove some of the low end so that it's better able to punch through. And of course, finally at the end, another instance of Redux, sitting at 8 bits again. Cool. Now that sounds really crunchy. So let's do those hats. Okay, with the hats, we're going to do something different. I'm going to go for a sample, put it into Ableton Simpler, and use a MIDI track. Now, the hats is where you can get really creative with the rhythmic stuff. It's just easier to get a groove and find the groove you want. In this case, I'm going to go for a triplet or shuffle feel. This is an iterative process. If you've ever done it, you'll know what I mean. It can take some time. So what I've done is I've sped this up. Right, so in the final pattern, I've added some variation. I've removed the last hat on the 3rd bar and added a quick triplet run in the last bar to emphasize the turnaround. However, I'm feeling it still needs a little bit more movement. So what I've done here is added a couple of MIDI effects. Random, which changes the pitch. Now I've set it to a 3rd, which is only 2-3 semitones. He says, quickly doing his music theory. The 2nd is velocity. I've restricted the range again and the randomness for a more subtle effect. And finally, a channel EQ just to roll off any of that high-end brightness, which we don't really want in lo-fi. Next, I've created a group. Right, so to gel everything together better, I'm going to use Ableton's vintage tape channel effect rack, and I'm going to use the lo-fi tape preset. Now I'm just going to adjust the taste till I get it to sound how I want it to sound. And lastly, instead of a glue compressor, I've gone for the drum mix glue setting of the standard Ableton compressor. This is a personal preference. Right, that's pretty much it. But before we finish up, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. I've added some vinyl crackle to this, a bass line and a piano sample so that we can hear what those drums now sound like in context. Oh, and I've added Ableton project file containing all the samples and the MIDI from here, and you can download it as a free download. You can rework it, you can take it to the next level, whatever you want to do. Just remains for me to say thank you and see you next time.